Hello and welcome back to the 186 YouTube channel. To celebrate our 9th episode, and not at all because no one we know has managed to play a decent game of X-Wing in the last 7 days, we thought we'd do something a bit different this week. We're going to take a look at opening engagements. We'll run through a number of games, look at the turns up to and including the opening exchange of fire, and decide who got the better engagement and why. To help us do that, we're joined by long-time X-Wing player, our good friend, and master of getting a good opening engagement, Matt Button. Hi, Matt.
Hello.
I thought for a second
you were going to
introduce me then, and then realised it was definitely Matt instead.
And so, other than that it's nice to talk to Matt, there's a sort of specific reason we got you on to do this episode. It's sort of dating back to an idea that we had a couple of years ago now whilst playing. And why don't you talk us through that, Matt?
Yeah, so the short version was that we started calling it Zen X-Wing, but actually has its basis in Aido, which is a martial art that a good friend of mine does, which is it's a sword-based martial art. So that it's not about sparring like kendo or fencing. It's about that single blow that will win you the match. So this is something we started talking about. You say it was a couple of years ago. It was definitely during first edition, where we'd maybe take a photo of the opening engagement and say, have I done all right? So this is basically everything from turn 0 to jostling for position right up until the first kind of exchange of shots, basically.
Yeah, it's pure, it's calm, it's not about rolling dice and crossing your fingers. It's just about, are you better at positioning than your opponent?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So we're going to start off here with the opening of a recent game that Lloyd and I played. I'm running Boba Fett and 2 Skull Squadron pilots, and Lloyd is running a beefy Separatist swarm. And you join us here just as we're completing setup. As soon as I'm talking, I might as well say what I was aiming for. I brought the gas clouds because they have some effect on droids. They can't just sort of sit on them or ignore them. And I was aiming to kind of make a wall of the gas clouds that I could engage kind of in or around, hopefully have some of Lloyd's list on the other side of that wall to me. And trying to keep a corner open to kind of have an open flank to sweep around if I wanted to. And I was relatively happy with this asteroid setup. Lloyd, how did you like the kind of turn 0 stuff?
So going into the match, obviously you knew that I was running Separatists, and so I knew that I wasn't going to see 6 proper obstacles. I was going to see 3 coward clouds, which is what we've got here. So based on that, knowing I only had 3 obstacles to place, I was trying to do 2 things. So firstly, I want a wall of rocks that I can engage from, or ideally make you engage through. And secondly, because of this specific list, it uses probe droids. I need to not have an early engagement. I want to delay a couple of turns so that I can get locks onto ships. So what I don't want to do is set up in a position where we can joust each other. And so what we've got here is no kind of big channels through the middle where your entire list can joust through. So that I can get a turn or 2 of kind of staying on my board edge and to get my probe droids into play. So actually, again, I think I was also quite happy with the setup here. But I've got all of the rocks relatively close to each other.
Yeah, I think the droids and the landing struts do make things different. And although the rocks are far more advantageous to you than they are to me, I think that you can still use them as the kind of player opposing the droid swarm, and they do at least slow you down, right? You can't fly completely over them or through them in the same way that other players can't. And if you are going to stop on them, it sort of limits you for next turn. So I'd have been far happier to see 6 gas clouds. But I think you don't necessarily, against a droid swarm, want to be spacing them out too much, because then you've done what the swarm element of it wants to do and given them nice, clear routes to get at you. Interesting that you say you didn't want the joust. I think I can completely understand why. But I think even the benefit for me of going quick and shutting down your efficiency with the probe droids, I think I'd just have been crossing my fingers when it came to that opening engagement. Absolutely. And I could still get a better engagement than a joust. So I think we're both trying to kind of not just straight joust each other here.
Yeah, and I think it's something we've moved away from a lot in certainly as second edition has kind of developed, where I think in first edition we tended to run more jousty lists. And if jousting is your entire plan, then obviously that's fine if you're running up against something that doesn't want to joust you and you can force it into it. But if you run up against something else that does want to joust you, or if that is the only thing your list can do, you are entirely dependent on the dice working the way they should or going in your favour. There's no extra scope for you to do anything above and beyond, right? And that's, I think, where we've come to with these engagements and these type of lists that we fly a bit more now.
So Matt, looking at the sort of turn zero stuff, the setup, anybody sort of setup you prefer? Anything that's kind of surprised you about either side?
I think the options with the swarm are really open. I like that, but obviously with some couple of very, very quick skull squadrons, you can kind of bait and switch with those really well against the swarm. But I think you've both got your options nice and open there, so I don't think anyone's particularly come off worst in that initial setup. What are you saying about using the gas clouds as your preferred place to come through at? Obviously, you're going to have to work quite hard from that position to make the most of those. But it'd be interesting to see how you jockey for position in those first few turns to try and make the most of that.
Yeah, I agree. And with Lloyd's centre of the board setup, I kind of wasn't thrilled. It would have been much easier for me, I think, to get those gas clouds genuinely in between me and Lloyd's ships if he'd gone to either corner, because I could have kind of start to circle the board and kind of manoeuvre him to the other side of them. I think what the central position does give me, and that's part of the reason I set that sort of central fang up, is that I think what I want to do now is split my forces a bit, so I can either try and drag some of Lloyd's list to this bottom side of the board, and then run to the clouds myself, or at the very least have the guy who's got the clouds as cover coming around the side and kind of being an annoyance from there. So yeah, I completely agree with you. I think Lloyd's setup has negated what I was trying to do with turn zero somewhat.
And I think it's worth pointing out as well, so I've set my ships up slightly differently to how I had in all of my practice games because of the ships you have. Because you have the two fangs, so you have both the offensive and the defensive passive mods, right? So not only do I not want to joust, but I've also staggered my Discord missiles. So I've got Droid 1 and 2 on the front line, and Droid 3, which is the red one, is in the back centre, just because it gives me a bit more coverage for those Discords. So I can fire them at different lengths. And if you do get in close, the red still gives me a potential of dropping a Discord into a ship that is at range 1 of the front of my line.
Yeah, and that's a really nice trick, right? Especially exactly as you say, I'm going to be going in hard to get to range 1. Those Discords are a massive issue for my Skull Squadrons. Boba's not going to love them either. And if range 1 gets me everything, it gets me both offensive and defensive bonuses, and it flies me underneath your Discord range, that would be amazing. So having that guy at the back is going to make it much harder for me to achieve range 1 and avoiding the Discord missile.
Yeah, and I think if we did this again, actually, I probably would have flipped the entire line so that I would have 2 Discords at the back and 1 at the front. I think that was possibly a takeaway from me for this game.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar, that sometimes you want the Discords further back in your line. But as you say, having them at different ranges so that you can threaten it a couple of turns in a row on the initial engagement.
So here in the opening, I'm kind of expecting you to go slow, given your central position. It didn't make any sense for you to kind of commit into that bottom corner of the board, because that kind of, if you were going to do that, why not just set up in the bottom corner and go and try and scare me? And there didn't seem to be any particular reason to kind of turn hard up in. So I was kind of expecting the slowish moves forward, which is what you've done. And this Fang is kind of heading off, as I said, to try and present 2 different threats to your list, so everything isn't coming from the same direction. And then with the other guys, I'm kind of going to try and stall them a bit so that I get some information about where you're going and in which direction you're committing before I decide where I'm going next. And so you can see sort of using that right-hand Fang to stall Boba, and that's something that I kind of intended from the start, right? That was why he was on Boba's left-hand side in the setup there. This was kind of always the plan, to kind of stall Boba and get some information. And
I think
kind
that's
of
absolutely the right thing, right?
Yeah, and what enabled me to do that was the fact you hand set up for the joust. In the middle with the rocks in the way, I know that I've got at least a couple of turns to sort myself out. Whereas if you had set up straight for the joust, I couldn't run the risk of Boba not moving anywhere on the first turn because he could get caught on the second.
Yeah, And likewise, what you see with the droids with the barrel roll left is just giving myself a little bit more distance from you in case you had come hard down that line, because I don't want to be jousting into your entire list. Certainly not until I've got opposition or a chance to get locks in place. So the barrel roll left just gives me a little bit more distance, but still means I've got all of my options open. So I think essentially what we're saying is that both of us here are being a bit kind of cagey and waiting for the other person to commit to something.
Yeah.
So Paul, knowing that the probe droids were in the list, and knowing that that obviously enables him to slow play a bit more to get the locks ready for the first engagement, were you not tempted to be a bit more aggressive?
Certainly it was in my mind, and it was something I was considering. I think that if you're going to take a droid list with the probe droids in it, you need to be careful, right? I think you can come unstuck, because if the turn you're taking all your locks on is the turn that your opponent sort of burns towards you hard and engages, and you don't have those calculates, then you're in a bad situation, right? Then you start losing droids quickly. So it was in my head, but I didn't want to, as we said at the start, I didn't want to straight joust. I've played a lot of droid squads, and if I'm being perfectly honest with myself, I'm probably a bit kind of overly scared of them. I've had kind of a couple of games that could have gone either way that I lost, and so I think in my mind I probably think they're a bit more powerful than they are. So it's kind of my experience of just straight jousting the droid swarm has been that I lose almost whatever list I'm running. So I didn't want that, and I thought that having to accept the fact that Lloyd was going to have some target locks on me was a kind of lesser of two evils, and I'd be in a better position turning in and getting a good engagement, good position on the board with some target locks on my ships than I would be just straight jousting at Lloyd's to prevent him getting those target locks.
Yeah.
So Lloyd, sounds like you were kind of anticipating, me going slow, and I was you. So kind of what are you now thinking with your position here in terms of what kind of options are you looking at, and what are you trying to cover?
So what I'd like to generally is get both probe droids in play together. So obviously I can only drop or launch one per round. So in the next round I'll have the opportunity to drop the second one. And once you get two on the board, they give you an enormous amount of coverage. And because they move in the system phase and my ships move at I1, I can potentially get locks from very far away. So here we have your top fang is basically almost still within its deployment zone. And yeah, I'm getting close to a point where I can potentially take locks on it this turn with my entire list if I want to. But what I don't want to do is just commit to one area and give you an easy approach with the rest of your list. So again, I want to try and kind of give myself a position where I can keep options open, react to where I think you're going to be, because the majority of your list certainly is still multiple turns away. So it's twofold. I'm looking at managing my ranges as they come in so I don't give you a chance to get easy shots into me. Try and avoid getting into positions where you can get range one shots into me, particularly because that's where all of your mods come from. And just giving myself options to react in future turns to where you move to.
Mm-hmm. And from my point of view, I'm kind of, given your positioning and the probe droid, I'm kind of expecting now that you're going to commit a sizable chunk of the list to my Fang there in the middle of the board. And I've kind of got mixed feelings about it. He feels a bit isolated at the moment. He's range 3 away from my other ships. But I'm happy that I've drawn you into that area of the board. That's the area of the board with the obstacles that benefit me. And so at this point, I decided that, okay, you've kind of bitten on that Fang. That is fine as long as I get Boba and the other Fang involved. So they're going to attempt to. My top Fang is going to try and delay for a turn and not take any fire this turn. Meanwhile, I think that at this point, I've almost, the benefit of your flying is that I've almost got to commit with Boba and the Fang. I could try and send Boba on the flank, but I think that if I do that, I risk him arriving late to the party and the Fang's already being dead. So I'm sort of going to try and get everything over to those gas clouds in a hurry now. And this I wasn't expecting. So you kind of peel half your lift off here, presumably to cover the flank?
Yeah, it's a difficult one because your Fangs are essentially bait in that they're 50 points. Boba is the big threat in your list, and Boba can very easily roll around one-shotting droids and take nothing in return. And so I have to be aware of Boba and I have to have a plan for him. But the Fangs can also one-shot everything in my list. So as much as for you, they're kind of almost like disposable tools, like you'll trade a Fang for a position. I can't afford to let you do that because that's death for me, right? Like, if you can take 2 droids off before Boba even gets into the fight, then I'm in a world of trouble. So I think in this situation, whether the Fang was, it kind of gave me an opportunity to get not 3 shots into it, but definitely get it into a position where either I had to just run from the fight or I could get a fairly good engage into it. What I think wasn't expecting was you to commit as hard into this area, because if you do, and the fight then happens in the left-hand corner, you're coming through the rocks, which is exactly what I want. And I didn't think you would give me a situation where that would occur. So I actually expected you to either delay a bit longer or come down the bottom of the board. And so I think in this case, as we see with this Fang, I've misread slightly your intentions.
In terms of the open engagement, what are you trying to? Are you trying to get guns on Boba as the big threat, or are you trying to clear a Fang?
No, I absolutely want guns on Boba, because Boba is the thing that my list doesn't have an answer for unless I get everything shooting at Boba.
Yeah.
And so I've got 2 sets of plasma torps in this list on the 2 bombers, which you can see now at the top. And one thing I've definitely done here, where this setup, what I've done is I've bitten on the Fang with the two bombers, and that's definitely a mistake. What they should be doing is going hard for Boba instead. So if we were doing this again, this would be 3 Trade Federation drones rather than 3 or 2 bombers in the drone, because I need the bombers to be threatening Boba and making him be aware of that at all times.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so we had the kind of opening shot of the game there, and as we said, we're going to go up to the opening fire, but that's not really the engagement, right? So we're going to go 1 turn further and see what happens. Lloyd dropping out his second probe droid here. Arguably a slight mistake from me there, in that I took the range 3 obstructed through a gas cloud shot with no mods into a bomber, so incredibly unlikely to do any damage. I did it because I thought it was my only option, but actually I could have shot at the probe droid. Probably not a huge mistake, because once we're in the engagement, you kind of have to be taking your calculates a lot of the time, but could potentially come back to haunt me later on. And definitely, taking a reasonably good chance of taking the probe droid off the board is better than an approaching 0% chance of doing any meaningful damage to the bomber. So slight error on my part there. Looking at the position now, Matt, do you have a strong preference from one side or the other? I think that it's pretty even still.
I think you've got the better of it at the moment. I think the group of 4 drones in the left-hand side, obviously they can turn in, but they're probably not going to be getting any meaningful shots in against anything. And I think you've got the position for all 3 of your ships to focus in on the 2 bombers and the remaining drone at the top. You're quite likely to be able to take off one of the bombers this engagement if you can get the other Fang and Boba in fast enough, which you should be able to do.
So my thinking here is I'm relatively happy. The Fang number 2 could continue to disengage. He could sort of 3 bank or even 4 straight and try and keep range, kind of not wanting to take those plasma torps. But I think the risk of doing that is, one, that Lloyd goes quickly. Like if he 2 banks up to the sort of top right hand corner of the board here, he still catches me and I don't get a shot back in return. And the sort of second sort of possibility is that Lloyd at this point turns downboard and engages the other Fang and Boba. And if I've flown number 2 out of the fight, then I kind of lose that gun, and that's like obviously a significant portion of my list. So for me, he's kind of set with the 3 hard in, get as much ground as possible, use the boost if he needs to kind of get to range 1 of something and start hurting stuff. I think the nice thing is with the 3 hard, I don't think, because that lead ship, again, as Lloyd alludes to, possibly a mistake, but the lead ship being a bomber can only go 4 straight and then barrel roll. And I think the 3 hard is pretty unblockable, which is a kind of nice position to be in. I'm slightly worried about that lead bomber, the pink one, coming in between these gas clouds and blocking my Fang as it turns in. But the Fang's kind of set as well. It needs to get involved. So the 2 bank is as slow as it can go, and then it can use the boost to sort itself out if it needs to. And if I get a bump there, well, it's not the end of the world. I'll probably still be at range 1 of whatever's following up that pink bomber. And Boba will be coming in for a range 1 shot on the bomber itself. So I'm relatively happy. I think my only sort of tricky decision was what to do with Boba, and I kind of thought a lot about banking him up. So the two bank, I was slightly worried about whether I'd be able to then boost the other way to straighten up. Didn't hugely want to use the boost either, and anything that moves me towards the left-hand side of the board then puts me in range of these droids that we see turning in here. So I in the end, I decided to go straight, accepting that I'm going to be sat facing a gas cloud, but really to kind of minimise the amount of fire coming in on Boba here, because as Lloyd's already said, he's my big piece, his main game piece. He's the thing I need to not take too much damage. So Lloyd, as we see your ships coming in here, what's your kind of thought process about how this is going?
So at this stage, I'm in near panic mode with the droids, essentially, because I've misjudged or miscalled where you're going to go with Boba, and that hard turn down the board has left them really struggling to get into the fight. And so here you see them turning in as hard as they can, coming up shy of the rocks, and then barrel rolling in to try and get range. So it means they're probably getting shots this turn, but as these roll in, these both have concussion missiles, and they cannot link into a target lock. So now this turn, they're only going to be firing primaries. And this was a case of, from where they are, my choices next turn become even more limited if I don't do this. So at this point, I've given up the option of those 2 concussion missile shots, because either next turn I have to then land on a rock or go through a rock and take damage, and then I'm still not getting target locks. And so now my chances of firing concussion missiles in this game has gone way down. Because I'm also, now that we're into the fight, I'm going to need calculate tokens for defensive use as well. So that turn in from Boba, the previous turn, was actually massive. I don't know if you quite appreciated how important it was at the time, but it's meant that my droids now are really struggling to stay in the fight. And it was a gamble, obviously, when I split my list. I knew it was going to be. And what I was hoping is I could trade one of the Trade Federation drones for one of the Fangs and then engage everything else later on. And as it is, I'm now engaging your entire list with half of mine.
I was happy with that. As soon as you split your list, I think that is, if you're playing against a swarm, that's kind of goal one of the kind of opening of the game, is get some spacing in between different bits of their list. If you get their list sort of facing in different directions, then all of a sudden you can focus on part of it and try and take on part of it rather than engaging the whole swarm at the same time. Actually, as it is, I think the combination of the fact that these guys can link the barrel roll into the calculate and do have the hard turns to clear the stress next turn, I think you did a nice job of getting them back involved. But those bottom 4 droids, I'm really happy with the positioning of, because as you say, the front 2 guys are stressed. They're going to get poor quality shots this round. The back 2 guys are getting no shots, and actually the back 2 guys are quite limited in terms of where they go next turn. Yes, they can fly onto that rock that they're sat in front of, but if they do, that's where they're stopping, and that will delay them again the round after. And as I'm intending to have this engagement in the top right-hand corner of the board, on the other side as gas clouds, that all sort of works to my favour. The bit I'm less happy with was just your awareness, and this I think shows that you know what you're doing with the droids, where these barrel rolls are really important. And so being able to barrel those guys across, even though it sort of costs you a mod on the front bomber, because as you say, he's already got the lock, can't link into the calculate there. What it does do, we'll see in a minute, is it puts an incredible amount of pressure on my top Fang. So I'm pretty happy looking at all of this, apart from that I know that this top Fang who's turning in is in trouble. So we're coming in here to kind of our first engagement, and we're going to sort of see the final position, make some decisions about who we think did a better job, and then look at the dice. One, because it's exciting and interesting, and two, to prove that maybe the positioning isn't everything, and you still need to make good decisions about when you spend tokens, and good decisions about your maneuvering. And I think this is probably my first mistake. So I'm sat here at the moment at range 2 of the bomber and of the droid. And my thinking is, well, I've got to boost into range 1, right? I get the extra defensive bonus, the extra offensive bonus. You can't fire the torpedoes at me, which actually, given that I've got no shields, from a number of dice and a mod's point of view, doesn't make much of a difference. But again, I'm going to get that defensive focus. And so I kind of feel like I've got to straight boost this guy in. I'm quite happy with the positioning in terms of my other Fang. It's going to come up. It's going to also be able to focus fire that bomber. I think in hindsight, I probably could have afforded to get Boba in a slightly better position. I think there was, the bank in and not being not facing sort of right at this gas cloud. Would have had me in a better position for the turn after the initial engagement. So the boost in here, and what that boost has done, and honestly thinking back, I don't know whether I did that knowingly or whether it sort of just was a necessary evil. But what it has done is put me into Discord range of that yellow droid there. And again, exactly as Lloyd explained in the opening of the game, having him in the back line, having him behind the bomber, meant that however fast I went, it was incredibly difficult for me to get into range one of the ships I wanted to be in range one of without being in Discord missile range. And then Boba's rolled up here. So
just as you do Boba, talk through your decisions for his action here, because you take a lot, because I think we're about to see in a second. And I, from your side, hated that move. From my situation, I absolutely loved it. Do you want to talk us through it?
So my thinking is that Boba isn't taking a lot of fire this turn. So he's got shots incoming from the green and light blue droids, both at range 3. So maximum 2 hits into them. Obviously, if I take 4 shields, that's a disaster, but the average is probably 1 to 2 shields. And at this point, what I want to do is I want to PS kill your bomber before it fires, because I'd prefer to have 2 shields off Boba and an alive Fang fighter than I would to have a fully healthy Boba and a Fang fighter that blows up. So that was the kind of decision point. It's, the third shot you could have on me from your bomber, well, it would be taking the shot that you don't have a target lock for, which seems unlikely with your back bomber there, the white guy in the middle. And also it's through a gas cloud. So I kind of discounted that and decided that was a shot you weren't going to take. And using that target lock, I get hit, crit, and you're sitting there with no defensive mods, but you get sort of 2 nice evades there and take a single crit. So let's kind of decide now who we think's won this in terms of opening engagement. And I think, having said last turn that it looked like I'd got the better of it, I think it's ended up far more even than that. So given the sort of position of stuff that's on the board at the moment, Lloyd, how did you feel this had gone?
So I don't mind the exchange at the top, right? I'm always going to lose out in one-to-one trades, but the fact that I've got potentially 3 shots into a Fang and a Discord missile on it means that it's got not a great chance of dying, but a reasonable chance of taking a lot of damage. But the part I loved about this engagement turned out being the fact that I've got 2 shots into Boba, who's got a force for defense. And it's not going to do a huge amount of damage, as you say, like it might do 1 or 2 shields. But if it spikes and I get 4 and all of those shields are gone, all of a sudden those Discord missiles become enormous. And so that's why I thought the lock from Boba was really interesting, because if I was in a situation, I would have been much, much more defensive, knowing that he's going through a gas cloud next turn. The last thing I would have wanted was for him to be losing shields, getting shot at range 3, which is the last place he wants to be.
Yeah, and I think that's valid. I think it's a little bit about win condition, right? And I don't think you're wrong, and I don't necessarily think what I'm about to say is wrong, but I think whereas you've been like, right, my win condition is keeping Boba alive into the end game, in my head, the win condition was taking droids off the board as quickly as possible. So the more offensive move for me, as I said, it was calculated risk. I didn't think I was going to take much damage here. And for me, if I kill a droid around, then after 2 or 3 rounds, Boba can clean up. Boba can handle 4 droids on his own, but he probably can't handle 5 or 6 on his own. So I wanted those Fangs to stay around for long enough to get Boba into a position where he could just take the swarm on his own. It would have been better, certainly, if Boba wasn't facing this cloud. The reason I kind of accepted it was that my thought was that this open engagement up at the top of the board was going to go in my favour, and that actually what I'd probably do with Boba next round is to kind of bank him to the right-hand side of the board over that gas cloud and have it there for defence. So have range, have the gas cloud, and then bring Boba back around and engage with them afterwards. as it is, the sort of opening half of the engagement went well for me, and I took that bomber off the table. But then things start to go awry. I had to spend, I didn't have to, but I spent the focus with my Fang, that middle yellow Fang, to get sort of guarantee the kill. And actually, the one shot he's taken this round has just snuck a crit through. So I sort of, that felt a bit unlucky. Obviously, if you've got no tokens on defense, that's a risk. But I was kind of unhappy with that. That wasn't in my planning. That wasn't in the kind of thought process of what would happen. So I'm now sat with one who's taken a crit, another one who's going to take a crit at the end of the round, and I'm starting to be a little less happy. But if we kind of ignore what actually happened, I was also relatively happy with the position. I thought it had gone pretty well. The bits that I liked about my opening engagement were that I'd got good focus fire onto a droid, highly likely to take it off the table before it fired, and also that half of your list was having now to turn hard and come through gas clouds at me. So I was likely to be able to get the gas clouds in between me and your droids, and that you were going to have to sort of fly over them, fly around with them, and deal with them, and sort of the engagement was going to happen where I wanted it. So I was pretty happy. And so I suppose the deciding vote, Matt, goes to you. You're going to award it to one side or the other, or kind of call it a draw?
It is difficult because obviously from a damage race point of view, you need to be getting up on the damage race and taking droids off the board as quickly as possible, which you've succeeded in doing that for the cost of one damage and probably another damage from the.
So up until this point, I wasn't going to focus on the damage because it's horrible flashbacks. But up until this point, it was looking okay. But that unmodded yellow drone there has just put 2 crits into my Fang, who's sat there with the focus. We're not going to go on to show the rest of the match. Actually, full disclosure, we forget one of these crits, and it has a pretty big impact over the course of the game. But I was very pleased with myself, other than forgetting that the crit has happened, at how I didn't get tilted by this. I think my initial reaction here was to kind of flip the table and leave. But as it was, I kind of got my head back in it and did okay. But yes, so.
But so I mean, if you were just looking at that from the beginning of the combat phase, so discounting dice variance, you'd expect to be way ahead at the end of that combat round. Okay, you got lucky. You got unlucky with the pot shot halving one of your other skull squadrons as well. But I think overall you'd expect to be better off from the damage point perspective given that position. But I think the Boba isn't in a great position, and you've got an awful lot of droids that are coming in, kind of should be able to get in quite quickly. But you're right, they are going to be engaging through the gas clouds, which can sit. So I'd probably say it's slightly in your favour, but not by a huge amount.
Yeah, and I think that would be my assessment as well. I was pretty happy, but this is by no means an engagement I look at and go, ha, I've completely outflown Lloyd. I've won now. Lloyd, so just to sum up on this one before we move on to the next game, do you think that's a fair assessment by Matt, or you see it differently?
No, he doesn't know what he's talking about. No, I think it's absolutely fair. I think the mistake I made, as I say, was I got greedy, thought I could catch that Fang out and catch it isolated. I managed to catch it, but it wasn't isolated. The rest of your list was able to come back in and support. And so then we end up actually trading relatively evenly. But the piece I lose is one of my tools for dealing with Boba, whereas the piece you lose is one of your fairly disposable pieces.
Yeah, I think that's a really good assessment.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's it. I won. We all heard. And on to the next game. So moving on to our second game here. This is a game between one of our 186 members and a good friend of ours, Ben Taylor, and again myself. This was a practice game. And both, I think it's probably fair to say, playing the list for the first or second time we've played them. I am running Han Solo with engine upgrade and the 2 good B-Wings, both with selfless, and 10 num with auto blasters and a new stabilized S-Force card. And Ben has taken a kind of, I suppose, variant of Cormac Jedi, but a first order version with Major Von Reg with Daredevil, Kylo Ren with Advanced Optics, Lieutenant Evis, and an Epsilon Squadron Cadet. First order. So I think this is a good example of kind of hitting a new list and having to my kind of the first step in getting good open engagement, I think for me here is identifying kind of my target priority and kind of how I would ideally, kill the ships and the order I'm going to deal with them in. And so for me, the issue with Ben's list is Major Vonreg. I think once he's off the board, or if I can get him out of the game, then Han Solo becomes a real powerful piece. But until he's gone, Han Solo just needs to be a bit more wary, a bit more careful, especially with Vonreg's ability to kind of get the target locks and double mod. If he's able to arc dodge me, take those strain tokens without any risk, and consistently fire 3 double modded dice into Han Solo, then Han Solo is not going to last long enough for me to get the win. So my thought process at the start of it is that I'm going to try my best to go after Vonreg, either to kill him or at least to scare him away into a bad position where he can't be involved in the game for a couple of turns, at which point I'll then turn in on the rest of Ben's list and take that out. So that's kind of my thought process. From the rocks, from my side, because of Han Solo's ability and because of the relative lack of maneuverability of the B-Wings, I want quite an open spread of rocks. So there's always an obstacle for Han to be near to trigger his ability, and the B-Wings have got space to perform those barrel rolls. The kind of key thing with 10 Num with the title is he can barrel roll linked to red target lock, so he can get his target lock and his stress and have a double modded attack in the same way Braylon Stram does. But whereas Braylon focuses and then performs a red barrel roll, which he can fail and still end up double modded with that stress for the rerolls and the focuses, 10 actually needs to be able to complete his barrel roll, so he does need a bit more space normally than the B-Wings would to get their double mods. Lloyd, why don't we go to you? You kind of probably more experienced as a kind of ACR player than I am. What would you be looking at from Ben's side of the table in terms of the matchup?
So looking firstly at where the rocks have gone, Ben has placed the rocks rather than the gas clouds, the way you set up. So you, Paul, have placed gas clouds, Ben has placed rocks. And that's each of you placing your own obstacles. So it looks like Ben's trying to use the rock as something that Han needs to account for, and that he can't just land on it or fly over it without the risk of taking damage. Whereas the gas clouds for Han are fairly meaningless in that he doesn't roll a lot of agility, so the loss of an agility isn't as punishing. And so Han is more likely to fly through those. So I think he's sort of clustered rocks a little bit to give Han a bit of an issue, but what has resulted in is a very spread out board, which is, I think, pretty perfect for you as the Han player. So what Ben's going to have to do is find a way of clearing things off the table quickly. And I think looking at this list, obviously Han is the thing you want to take off the table because it makes Vonreg have free reign. But with 2 copies of Selfless, that might potentially be a very slow grind and very difficult to do. So as much as you would like to, I think maybe if you can keep Vonreg safe, you take 10 Num off the table first because he's the easiest thing to kill. And then once you're down to 2 ships, then Han can die while you've still got ships on the table, I think would be my approach. How do you feel about that, Matt?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think definitely you've got the better of it in terms of the placement of the obstacles. And you're right, as soon as you see Selfless, then it's a really difficult decision about how much, well, it depends how much damage you can punch through in one go. But I think with the ships he's got there, then it definitely makes sense to try and focus down 10 Num first.
And we don't see a lot of Kylo's ability carrying out the dark side, but with 2 copies of Selfless in play, it's almost meaningless, right? Because you don't have a way of automatically generating crits as the First Order player. So you're relying on just rolling them. And then the Rebel player can just choose to take them onto whichever ship he wants, essentially.
Yep.
Yeah. It's one of those ones where you kind of, it'll be the only game in a tournament where you consistently roll crits and you'll hate it every time it happens as you smear damage across the list.
It's worth noting, I actually quite like the position of your B-Wings. So you said obviously that 10 needs to complete his barrel rolls. The way that you set this up with 10 at the bottom, obviously you've got the first gas cloud to get past, but you're unlikely to be shooting at each other in that time if you do decide to joust, which I wouldn't expect you to be doing in this situation. But if you do decide to joust down that channel, you've got room for 10 to complete his barrel rolls to the left. I think it's worth noting that was you'd given yourself that option.
Yeah, and in terms of setup, Ben's obviously put the two FOs in the middle, and it's something that we as a group quite like doing with the low initiative stuff, is to kind of place it in the middle to give your opponent more to think about, right? So they can't, generally there'll be a rock in the middle, and so they can't run straight at you. Actually, Ben's sort of set them up down this channel, and I might have set them up, even more centrally, so slightly above where they are at the moment. But the other thing it does is it doesn't allow you, so it's harder for your opponent to straight joust you if they want to do that, and it's harder for them to get far away from you if they want to do that. If their game plan is to go in a corner in the opposite corner to your setup, well, putting them in the middle means that you can close them down that bit quicker. So I've mirrored that with the B-wings. I don't want those two TIE fighters to kind of get round behind me. They're not going to do a huge amount of damage, but I can't ignore them. I can't allow them to just get multiple free shots over the course of the game. So I kind of set up to threaten them on the setup. And then Han in a position where he could hard turn and swing in behind my B-wings, or he could go hard for the top corner of the board if he needed to kind of get around that corner. And then Ben ummed a little bit about whether to put Vonreg in the bottom corner of the board here or to go up by Kylo. I think he probably chose wrong in the end. I think had he put Vonreg in the bottom corner, to complete my plan of kind of scaring Vonreg out of the game or killing Vonreg, I'd have had to go quite hard for him. I'd have had to swing Han round, bring him up board, and then bank out to the bottom edge of the board around this gas cloud. Meanwhile, Kylo and those TIE fighters are in a nice position to flank me. By putting the two sort of high value targets both in the same corner, I've only got one thing to aim for here, and it makes my decision making a bit easier. So I sort of set off banking towards, keeping my options open. I've still got the banks and the barrel rolls to get into the bottom half of the board if I want to. The hard turns still work. And then I think I start slow with Han, so I get a bit of information about where Ben's going and what he's thinking about before I commit.
And there's a reason you have Han's arcs front and back.
My feeling with Han is, if I get rushed, if I get an engagement earlier than I want it, then it's likely to be head-on into Han. If Ben's chasing me or coming in from the side of me, it's likely that I will have time to realise that's going to happen and move my arc at some point. So my kind of worry is that I get rushed, that he drives straight on into Han, and what I don't want to be doing is having to spend my action on that opening engagement rotating my arc rather than getting modifiers. Does that make sense?
I think it does, yeah.
So you're thinking of bringing Han in, well, essentially playing like a non-turreted ship in those first few engagements, rather than kiting it around the board and taking broadsides.
Yeah. So my thought is, and you can see I've kind of one straighted and then boosted where Ben's kind of list is at the moment. Like, I think that coming up along this top board edge is going to work well, because if Ben wants to commit to Han, he's going to get broadsided by both my B-wings. And I think from this position here, I'm going to have a couple of turns to realise what's happening. If Ben turns Kylo away, turns everything away, and it becomes obvious that it's going to be Han circling the board, shooting out of the side arc, I've got time and turns where I can freely rotate the arc without worrying too much. I think if Ben next turn commits hard into this top lane of the board, then we could get an engagement on that turn, and then I definitely don't want to be wasting actions with turret rotations. I need to be getting mods for offense or defense. So we can see here that Ben has sort of committed quite hard up board actually with Vonreg on that opening turn, and so I'm pretty happy looking at this that I'm going to get the opportunity to at least attempt to do what I want to do. Han's got the nice kind of 3 banking, can boost, can sit there and focus, or can boost if he wants to really pressure Ben. And meanwhile, I think from this position, my B-wings are quite happy to just come straight up into this gap between the central rock and the gas cloud in the top right-hand corner. Ben, I think, realising that he doesn't want everything in the top corner, it's hard to those first sort of pilots back out, which is a move I quite like. Matt, what are you thinking about? Sort of, do you like that move from the FOs, or would you done something different?
No, I think he needed to get them back in. I think where the B-wings are looking to go, they're kind of threatening the approach from Kylo, whilst obviously being put in a position to chase after Von Reg to support Han coming round, which means that you need to be getting something in behind. So if Von Reg had been at the bottom of the screen as we're looking at it, then he would have been in perfect position to come in behind. But those two FOs, they should be able to get some decent shots in if they can get in there quick enough, because that's not what your focus is going to be.
Yeah, I think I agree. I was looking at Ben's position and not liking it, and thinking the only option he had was to turn the FOs down and barrel them exactly as he did to give himself more choices this turn. And what he wants to do, is worth noting, is get Reverse and presumably the Epsilon as well into range 1 or 2 of those B-Wings when the B-Wings come to be taking actions, because Reverse will then get locks on whichever B-Wing he wants, which we think should be 10 none. With his ability, so then you're getting double modded shots into B-Wings, and that will help burn them down even with just 2 red dice.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely, and he's achieved that really nicely, right? If he'd any other move there would have really committed him too far into that corner, but actually he's kind of brought it back nicely, and now has the straights and banks open to exchange fire with my B-Wings if I was to bank them left next turn, or if I do kind of continue to commit to Von Reg up at the top of the board here. To get in behind the B-Wings. Kylo's done quite a nice job of getting himself out of trouble as well. As you say, where those B-Wings were was kind of threatening him. Had he gone further into the corner of the board, would have been in that sort of same situation where all Ben's threats are coming from the same direction, and it's easy for me to point my arcs at them. I think the boost does limit Kylo's options next turn a little bit, but he's got the hard to get in, and he can, if he wants to, turn his arcs towards the B-Wings.
But like all of this, depending obviously on Von Reg doing something similar. So Von Reg here needs to go either very fast or 1 turn away, which he has. But the 1 turn away now, because you were so aggressive with the harm, means that Von Reg might be involved in shooting before he wants to be.
Yeah, and with the boost there, I was kind of gambling on Ben turning away. That's a little bit of, obviously we play against each other a lot, and I know Ben is more cautious rather than sort of outrageously aggressive. And also, with me banking in, if I hadn't boosted, it would have been a massive risk for Ben to 5 straight. You know, actually where he was, the 5 straight is beautiful, right? 5 straight, boost straight, and then you're in the side of Han, who is going to struggle to turn around to get back at you. The B-Wing, you've got a gas cloud in between you and the B-Wings, and I'm in bad shape. But you were playing so specific. That would have been playing so specifically for me, both banking and then boosting.
It's only a maneuver that looks good after you've taken all of your actions with the I6 ship.
So Von Reg barrel rolling here and getting himself out of range. I think a little bit of uncertainty from Ben in terms of the ranges. So took the deplete to do so, which is, you know, it's Vassal, as I say. This was a few weeks ago, and we're all still learning the kind of ranges on Vassal. But small things like that make a difference. Von Reg now either is going to remain depleted or is going to have to do a blue move if he wants to get all his guns turned back on. And so we are coming into now the kind of the initial engagement proper. And again, it's fairly even. I think from my point of view, the thing that makes me happy is Von Reg's position. My B-Wings, with Von Reg turning out there, I think he's incredibly unlikely to turn back in. So my B-Wings are kind of committed to coming through this gap between the asteroids. Now, that's not ideal for me. As discussed, it makes things more difficult for 10 Num in terms of getting his barrel roll and target locks in to be as powerful as he could be. But Braylon doesn't mind this position between the rocks. And I've got quite a nice opportunity to flank with Han. And Han can actually achieve 2 things here on this turn. He can flank Kylo and the FOs, whilst also continuing to put pressure on Von Reg. From Ben's point of view, Matt, what are you thinking about sort of Ben's position and what his options are?
I'm a lot less cautious than Ben, and I'd be tempted to turn back in with Von Reg at this point, because I think the B-Wings are unlikely to come in to commit to that top edge. So you might be trading shots just with Han, but you're probably going to come off better than that. I mean, it's always a risk, but probably not looking at a range 1, or if you are, then you might be able to arc dodge. But so that's what I'd be tempted to do. But I think, given knowing Ben, I think he'll probably run for the hills with Von Reg, probably try and get some distance, and come back in towards his own table edge, and lead you away with Von Reg while bringing the other 3 back in behind.
Mm-hmm.
And that feels like a decision you end up making a lot when you're playing aces, right? Is that you end up in a sort of 50-50, and you're trying to guess what your opponent is doing, whether you need to run and disengage this turn, or whether you can turn in and try and squirrel around and get out of arcs that way. Matt, you've probably played aces most successfully out of the group of us, if not necessarily the most. I think I agree with you with the turn in. It does feel a bit risky, and what you don't want to be doing is trading a huge chunk of unreg for a couple of shields on harm.
Yeah.
But I think it is probably the option that gives you the most solutions, certainly for next turn as well, right? Because if the B-Wings have gone past you, you can put a deplete onto harm. He then becomes less scary, or at least it reduces his dial options. But surviving this turn is absolutely key. So I think what we see here is Ben here being forced into the decision because of the mistake he made early, which was to open with such a fast maneuver and take away options for himself.
Yep.
Yeah, he's having to kind of turn away hard to get away here. And I think for me, I agree, Matt. I think the thing that tips it, that sort of turn in versus turn away, is although it feels riskier, unlike last turn where it was a very specific set of circumstances that would make the risky move good. Actually, there's a number of benefits in the turn in. There's a high chance you get a bump, which is not a disaster in this instance, because I agree with you, it's very, very unlikely that the B-Wings commit hard to the top of the board. From my point of view, the B-Wings cannot assume that Von Reg's coming in and turn into him, because what they do by turning up board is give their flank or their rear to the rest of Ben's list. And actually, even if I catch Von Reg, that's probably bad for me. And certainly if I do that and Von Reg turns away, it's a complete disaster.
Yeah, because even if you catch Von Reg there, or you make the wrong call and he's not there, then those B-Wings going to take a long time getting back into the fight.
You've got a number of good things that can happen. The bump is probably fine. The up close, you're more likely to be able to arc dodge with your double repositioning. You've got the barrel roll and the boost. And I think what Lloyd said is the absolute key, is that it gives you options for next turn. Hard disengaging here keeps you running. You're committed to running for another 2 or 3 turns. If you hard turn in, you can get past and start to harry kind of side of the B-Wings rather than just being running away for the next 3 turns.
Absolutely.
So we see the 3 banks here from Ben. I think with the Epsilon Squadron Cadet and with Revis, he decides to barrel roll. I think attempting to arc dodge the B-Wings. And I think that was suboptimal. Obviously easy to say in hindsight, and easy knowing where I'm going. But whereas with the Epsilon Squadron Cadet, he's successfully arc dodged. Because Revis was that bit more upboard and was never likely to be able to dodge the arcs of the B-Wings, there's no point arc dodging with one ship if you leave your opponent with an alternative target, especially when you're arc dodging with the cheaper, less important ship. Leaving your opponent the more expensive, more important ship to fire at. And so what Ben's done with the arc dodge there is not really achieved anything from an arc dodging point of view, and actually removed modifications. And so, as Lloyd said, though, Revis does pick up his target lock here when Braylon stresses. And 10 Num is able to tuck in behind. I think my judgment here, so as previously said, 10 Num needs to barrel roll first before he can get his target lock to get his double mods. My options are to barrel roll to the right, but I worry that puts me out of arc of Revis, and I obviously don't want to barrel roll out of a shot. So I decide to focus and then do the standard B-Wing trick of failing. I think I attempt the barrel roll to the left here, and it fails, meaning that I can pick up my stress as well to have sort of effectively 2 focus tokens.
And so I think I agree with you. The barrel rolls from the FOs were a poor idea. Sitting there having a lock and 2 focus tokens, these shots into Braylon is much more appealing than what he's ended up with. And obviously arc dodging at lower initiative is difficult and hard to judge. And I think, again, if Ben had been playing perhaps more frequently lately, he would have made a better decision with those. But it looks very much like it's going to cost him a significant chunk of a tie FO, or perhaps very little of Braylon. In terms of the barrel roll from 10, the decision to get a double focus gives you slightly more defensive capability on him. But he has a lock on Braylon. So what's the likelihood that Ben takes the shot into 10 when the lock is on Braylon? Because then 10 can afford to keep his dial clear and still have the options next turn of K-turning or Talon rolling.
Yeah, that's an incredibly valid point. As you say, almost with a lock on Braylon, I would prefer Ben to be shooting into 10, right? Because he's less likely to get it. So I think you're absolutely correct. I think that I could have afforded to not stress there, and as you say, what it would have done is kept the dial open for K turns and Talon rolls if I need them. Unlikely given where everything else in Ben's list is, but not to be locked down. I think my thought process was that the B-Wings are going to want to stick together, and with Braylon already stressed, there's a kind of an element of, well, is 10 likely to want to do a white maneuver if Braylon is doing a blue maneuver? But I think that's stretching a bit, and I agree with you that I probably shouldn't have stressed him there. Let alone, I think I was fairly confident, but had that barrel roll fit, then it would have been a disaster, right? And I'd have been sat in front of that rock. So I think Ben there locks 10 num with Kylo, and there were two reasons for that. I think he felt that the barrel roll could get him out of arc of Braylon, and so that he'd be just trading shots into 10. And also his target priority was 10, as yours would. And Revis obviously took the target lock of opportunity onto Braylon. Although I think probably could have switched it when I took the stress on 10 num.
I believe so, yes.
Or is it one side? Yeah. We see, meanwhile, Han sort of continuing to go fast, boosts around the corner there to sort of swing his arc onto Kylo, and Major Von Reg bails. And so this is what our opening engagement looks like. And I'm relatively happy. I would have liked to have got some mods with Han. I mean, I've got the Han reroll, but I'm pretty happy that I've achieved what I wanted to, which is that Von Reg is not firing in the opening engagement. It is in a tricky spot for next turn, in that I've got the hard turn in. Whether it clips the gas cloud or not doesn't overly worry me, and I can swing my rear arc round to cover almost everywhere Von Reg can be next turn. Meanwhile, I get long-range shots into Kylo, and my B-Wing's in a pretty good position to have a favourable exchange of fire versus Ben's list. What do you guys feel about the positioning?
I think I'd agree with that. The B-Wings are obviously, we discussed earlier that the B-Wings are probably, and specifically 10 num is probably the thing that you want to start taking damage off first, and he's not quite achieved that. He's going for Braylon instead, by the look of it, I'm assuming. But I think a few shields off a B-Wing is probably a small price to pay compared to probably doing a lot of damage to Revis and leaving Von Reg in a fairly predictable corner. So, yeah, I like it.
And Lloyd?
Yeah, I think we've got... So Ben has barrel rolled everything in his list this turn, and I like one of those barrel rolls. And I think Von Reg's is sensible, right? Take the lock, take any red token, roll away as your action. And so then you're in a reasonably decent position to 1-10 and then chase harm next turn. It does mean the B-Wings can turn towards you, but at the risk of getting blocked, at the risk of having the entirety of the rest of the list behind them. So I think the B-Wings still have their own things to deal with. But what Ben should have here is 3 modified shots, 2 potentially double modified shots into Braylon, because just a target of opportunity that Braylon was stressed, so Reaver's got the lock, and so I think you stick with that plan. And instead what he's got is a lot of relatively poor quality obstructed and range shots into a B-Wing. And so I think this feels like the turn before the main engagement, but it feels very unlikely that you're going to take much meaningful damage here, and Ben definitely could.
Okay. So from a damage point of view, I'm incredibly lucky with a hand reroll to sort of put 1 damage to onto Kylo at range 4, which is clearly just bad luck and not expected. But Ben then changing target goes for Braylon, does a couple of damage, but Braylon and 10 get shots back into Revis, and what we see here by the end is that Revis ends up on 1 health with a disable power regulator and ions, and actually the exchange of fire is that I've taken, I think, 2 or 3 shields spread across both my B-Wings, because Ben rolls some crits, and I use Selfless to kind of spread them out. And yeah, maybe I should have let this video roll on for another turn, and I don't. But I can tell you what happens next turn is that Han does do that 2 hard in, and the B-wings do swing up towards Von Reg, and I'm able to take Von Reg off the table and kill the 1 health Revis. Meanwhile, Kylo has disengaged hard to come around the back of the rock and doesn't get shots, and Ben actually sort of conceded from that point because, as I say, it was a practice game and it felt sort of uphill to come back from that position. So that was game 2. And I think, for me, a good example of that kind of clear game plan from the start. It's not always something I'm good at, but I think in this instance I did it quite well, of identifying the threats in the opponent's list, identifying your win condition, and my win condition was having Han alive after Von Reg was dead, and then sort of sticking to that plan. And I think from the flip side, from Ben, no, horrendous errors. He kept his options open with the maneuvers. He didn't fly into rocks or anything like that, but just a series of small suboptimal decisions which have led to a game state which is kind of the summation of all of those, which is quite an unfavourable engagement for him. Anything to add, guys?
No, I think I concur with all of that.
Cool. Right then. And so getting to our third and final game, we saved the best till last, primarily because this one you don't have to watch me fly, but also because these are two very highly skilled and very well-known players. Dale Cromwell, founder of the Dale Cromwell School of X-Wing, and Oli Pocknell, who I believe won something recently, but I can't quite remember what. So, Matt, these lists are far more up your street than the stuff we've been looking at previously, particularly Oli's, which is a sort of hard-hitting, high-initiative ace list. With the ace versus ace matchup, we can see here that Oli's got his worlds list, which is Vader with passive and afterburners, Grand Inquisitor naked, and Whisper with passive and Fifth Brother crew. And Dale, who has the bid and has given Oli initiative, has a more traditional Darth Vader with fire control system and afterburners, Suntifer with Predator, and Duchess, one of Dale's favourites, with Predator, Fifth Brother, and afterburners. So this matchup, how do you approach this, Matt? What are you kind of looking for?
So you're basically looking to figure out who you want to get into the end game, essentially. And there's a couple. Both of them have got a couple of really good options for end game ships. But also you're trying to figure out, in terms of, you're almost certainly not going to kill everything else in a normal length game in either of those two lists. So what do you need to take out from your opponent's list, and what can you not afford to lose? Or if you do lose it, what else do you need to kill? So it's all about target priority. But I think with ace lists generally, sometimes you just need to take the target of opportunity that presents itself. But you really want to have in mind like a kill list of who you want to take out first. So Vader is going to be top of that list in both of these because he's a really good endgame ship. He's obviously the most points in both of those lists. But if you lose yours, what do you need to do to get back in the game, basically?
Yeah, so really good point. This, perhaps more than any other, is like identifying that win condition, as you say, with 3 highly evasive, high agility ships on the board. That is unlikely to be total destruction of the opponent's list. And I really like how you put that. You've got your kind of plan A, which is I'm going to go and kill this ship, and I can afford to trade, in Dale's case, he could even afford to trade his Vader for Oli's Vader. At least on points, that puts him ahead. But always to have to stay flexible and to keep your eyes open for opportunities, because it may well be that you never get the opportunity to take out Vader, but Oli might park Whisper in a position where you can blow him up, and at that point, switching to that target could be the game-winning move. And from setup, it's a slightly weird one. So these lists are really balanced. Dale, obviously, kind of traditionally having the bid and moving second would be huge in these matchups. And it will be important. Dale has 2 I6s to Oli's 1, and his I5 is very, very maneuverable, given the ailerons on Duchess, in addition to the afterburners that can really kind of put Duchess almost anywhere she wants to be. The thing that kind of evens it up from Oli, and the thing that allows Oli to run this list at, I think it's 199 points these days, is those passive sensors on Vader, and actually just the raw kind of punching power of it, that Whisper can, to a certain extent, sit in front of stuff and keep its arc open. And actually, most aces are going to be intimidated enough by Whisper that they don't feel that they can take the risk of turning and engaging, even with the ability to kind of outposition them. And I think the other thing to mention here is the passive sensors on Vader. That means for all Dale's repositioning after Oli's Vader has moved, Oli's Vader will, when he shoots, which will be first as he's got initiative, be able to take a target lock and use that to do his barrel roll. And so he's got a limited amount of repositioning at initiative 7, shall we say, after everything else has moved.
Yeah.
So Lloyd, we're looking at the box setup here and the relative setups, kind of mirroring each other. Anything to learn from this opening?
I think what you see in both cases, they've kind of put their squirreliest ship, if that's a word, kind of isolated. So Dale looks like he's baiting with Duchess, and Ollie looks like he's baiting with Grand Inquisitor. Now we see Grand Inquisitor is turned in towards his own board edge, whereas Duchess is faced forwards. There's probably not a huge amount of difference now. I'd expect both of those ships to disengage, as Grand Inquisitor does, pretty hard. And they're bait, but they're bait with the other person knowing they're bait. So what you're hoping is that your opponent essentially overextends himself trying to get after that ship.
I think one thing that Dale setting up straightforward does do is that Ollie setting up alongside, there was really no pretense, or very, very little pretense that he was going to turn in. It was possible, but if he was, he does it slowly. Even if Dale were to hard turn Vader and Cynthia left, they would have time to sort themselves out again before the Grand Inquisitor got behind them. Dale, with his setup for Duchess, did at least threaten the possibility of going very fast straight down the board edge. Now, very, very unlikely that he would do that towards both of Ollie's ships, but probably holds Ollie in that corner a bit more than Ollie's Grand Inquisitor setup did. It would have been very difficult, given Duchess's position, for Ollie to turn both ships left and fly into this bottom corner of the board, because the risk there is that Duchess goes quick and gets behind you in the early game. A little bit of that, it's got a head games. We all know Dale. We all know he tends to be quite an aggressive player. So that kind of doubles down on it. I'm facing towards you. I'm aggressive. I like the joust. You're going to have to play for this aggressive move towards you. And that maybe just holds Ollie's ships in that top corner of the board slightly. But as it is, the two bait ships turning away as predicted. Ollie fanning out nicely. That decloak on Whisper's going to allow him to kind of really come along either board edge that he sat beside. And Dale, perhaps a little bit more tightly close together with Vader and Cynthia. They're both going to be coming from the same direction, but probably knowing Dale and Ollie, it's going to be more likely that Dale's the aggressor and chasing Ollie, trying to get a good position, whereas Ollie trying to kind of stall the opening engagement until such times that maybe Dale has overcommitted and got something out of position.
Ollie never wants to be taking more than one shot into each of his ships, whereas Dale is more of the approach of, if I can get 3 of my shots into your same ship, I don't really care what's coming back, almost.
Yeah.
I think Ollie, I don't think we've ever discussed this. Well, perhaps you have discussed this with Ollie about in terms of the whole Zen X-Wing thing. But I think Ollie is probably one of the ultimate proponents of it in terms of how long he takes to get to that first engagement and how long he's prepared to wait and keep engineering something until he's happy with it. Well, it can take a very long time before he'll commit to that first engagement.
But it's worth doing, right? And so the purpose of these videos, and you've seen in the 2 matches so far, if you do it right, you can give yourself a huge advantage in the game. In the first match we looked at, myself versus Lloyd, it was pretty even, and certainly even enough that maybe slight damage spike in favour of Lloyd meant that going on, that game was in the balance throughout. But if either of us had got it wrong, we could have tipped it massively towards the opposition. In the second game, me versus Ben, I did sort of pretty definitively get the better open engagement, and that actually led to, obviously it's not going to happen like this all the time, but I win the next turn. So it's worth doing, and it's worth doing well, and you will see that it is almost universal in terms of the players you see consistently making cuts, consistently at the top of tournaments, are all good at this phase of the game, perhaps above everything else. I think you can take it too far, and I think certainly that's something Ollie sort of would admit himself. There are occasions on which he spends so long looking for that perfect engagement that he kind of runs out of time to make up for bad luck. So he'll get a reasonable engagement and then get some bad dice variants and not have the time to come back. So there comes a point where you do need to sort of decide and go for it. But actually that point is is nowhere near the first 15, 20 minutes of the game. And actually, you're probably fine if you've done a good enough job of it, having your first engagement in the 45th minute and beyond is a completely valid way to engage.
Yeah, I think what it's worth looking at is there are multiple places and points in which you can win on those X-Wing games. And the one I think that is talked about most often, certainly on the internet, is list building. And list building can be a huge factor, but you can overcome shortfalls in your list or in a particular matchup with a very good turn 0 and with a very good opening engage.
Absolutely, yeah.
So looking back here, Duchess sort of continuing to disengage, which obviously makes sense with Vader coming down that board edge, and Oli kind of getting his ships together in the top edge of the board. Something I really like here from Oli, and something I don't see much, is that I think moving first, grouping your ships together is really helpful. Something we touched on in an earlier episode. Oli is going to be much less able than he normally is to arc dodge Dale's ships here, because the majority of them are moving after Oli's ships. So what he's done is he's brought his list together, and he's going to present a kind of concentrated cone of fire towards Dale's list next turn, which is much, much more difficult to engage than if Oli had continued to try and play the ace game, had his ships split up, then Dale could pick them off one by one. So I think that's really nice. The kind of bit I don't like so much from Oli is I feel that Vader went a bit fast that turn. And this, looking at it this turn, he's going to cut his options down. His 3 hard looks like it's dangerously close to that rock in the top left-hand corner of the board. And the 3 bank to chase after Duchess risks 2 things. It risks getting Vader out of the fight, because Duchess is quicker than Vader and can get away. And actually, if Duchess cuts hard back in here to the left, she could turn in and fire on Whisper or the Inquisitor with Vader facing the wrong direction. On the flip side, Dale made a couple of interesting choices towards the end there. He 3-harded Vader, and actually, I don't know if hopefully people watching caught it, but was sort of sat facing directly at this small rock in the centre of the board. Had the option to barrel roll either way, and chose to barrel roll to the left. I don't think that was the optimal move, and I'll let sort of Lloyd expand upon that, because this is something that we spoke about at the time when the game was going on. Meanwhile, Suntir kind of came up and boosted out, and sort of really opening his options up. Next turn, Suntir can go straight, get into that top right-hand corner and turn sort of boost around to get behind Oli's list, or he can hard turn back in to kind of focus fire on Whisper. So Lloyd, how do you feel about the kind of finer points of Dale's repositioning there, and what effect do you think they might have on this turn?
So I think it feels a little bit like, watching it a second time here, that he had in mind the boost here with Suntir and put Suntir into this position. And so then Darth Vader's barrel roll kind of had to occur to make space for it. And I think what it has done is it's meant that Darth Vader really only has sort of 1 or 2 options on his dial at this stage. So obviously anything going left to try and catch Oli's Darth Vader is an enormously large gamble on a very specific dial option. So really Vader can 1 forward or 5 forward. And that's kind of all he has on his dial at this point. He can either try and delay the engagement by another turn, or he can get aggressive and try and get into the middle of it and get shots onto things. And I think from where he is, it's meant that he's almost said explicitly that this engagement is going to occur just beyond that rock that he's just barreled away from. Mm-hmm. With a ship that is moving after everything in on his list, he is telegraphed very clearly exactly where he's going to be and exactly where his arc is going to be.
He's also limiting where he can be with Duchess, because Duchess can very easily block that 5 forward if he's not careful.
Yeah, and I think you read my mind, Matt, and I think that was my issue with it as well. Now, obviously, these are very good players, and it's very easy to sit here and criticise their choices after the fact. But if we look at the other option, if Vader, exactly as you say, Matt, Duchess now is limited in how quick she can cut into this engagement, because she does not, under any circumstances, want to block Dale's Vader. Had Dale's Vader rolled the other way, yes, Suntir wouldn't have been able to do this boost, but actually what he would have had is Suntir and Vader sat line astern of each other, threatening the middle of the board in a position where they could both four straight, five straight, get good quality close range shots on Whisper and or the Inquisitor. And crucially, with Oli having gone so fast with his Vader, he would have found it very, very hard to get back across to that right-hand side of the board to get shots on. Doing that and opening up those options also opens up the board from Duchess, who can then also come in much quicker, has a better chance of evading Vader's arc, and has a better chance of getting shots into the back two ships in Oli's list, into Whisper and the Grand Inquisitor. So tiny change, the direction of a barrel roll, but actually, I think we may be seeing coming into this engagement that it means that Oli isn't punished for that overcommitment with Vader, that he has the too hard and the barrel roll back in, and that he's probably going to be able to get arc on at least Duchess, if not trade shots into Dale's Vader. Meanwhile, Dale's ships are all kind of getting in each other's way.
And I think watching this live, we talked about what Dale's plan was from here and what he could do. And I think he had the option to delay the engagement here. So if Suntir potentially goes fast, so Suntir could fire forward into this gap and try and pressure Grand Inquisitor, or potentially even get behind Grand Inquisitor. If Grand Inquisitor is banking in, you've got a real opportunity there to get in behind and start getting free shots into a ship. If Grand Inquisitor is turning down, then you can. Oli obviously needs to anticipate what Suntir is doing in advance if he wants to have force and evade. And if he doesn't, then Suntir can go in there with more tokens than Grand Inquisitor has, or at least more variety of tokens, and almost ensure not taking damage. So I think looking at it, that was what we were thinking was potentially Dale's plan, to try and flank with Suntir and bait with the others. So Vader here would be doing a one forward, and Duchess would be perhaps even slooping out of the fight or rolling away and delaying it for another turn before turning back in.
Yeah, and actually looking at it now, and it's not something I considered at the time, but I think if you were going to do that, and if the plan was that five straight from her and Suntir, that probably what I would be doing with Vader is a hard turn. So if you too hard to the right, barrel roll away, then you're only taking shots. I don't think Oli's Vader can get to you. Because of that rock and the overcommitment, he can't come fast enough towards you. He can't do his 3 hard and afterburners, for instance. He's going to be within range 2 of that top board edge, because he's going to have to stay at the top side of that rock in the left-hand corner. And so you can too hard Dale's Vader, barrel roll him away. You may take shots from Whisper, but only if Whisper commits quite hard, which we know isn't generally Oli's style. And actually, it leaves his dial open the next turn to turn back in if you do want to go for the aggressive joust. You can 3 hard back in, you can use your afterburners, and you're in a position where Suntir is in a much better place to come into the fight. And Duchess is slightly more tricky in that scenario, but maybe wants to do something slower and kind of stay there or thereabouts where she's at the moment, to enable her to kind of pounce next turn as well. And that might have been a good way to get to sort of recover from that potential slight mistake with the barrel roll. And so we see Dale's dials down here. So Dale, obviously, despite what we said, clear on his plan, and Oli just taking a little bit more time to think about it. One interesting sort of aspect of where Oli is the decloaks from Whisper. Now, the decloak left is certainly not on. It's into that rock. And I would worry about the decloak right as well. I don't know what you guys think.
I was having exactly the same thought. So if he's only going to be able to decloak forward, I think.
No, the right,
as you say,
the right does definitely fit.
good timing, but yeah. So okay, that's Oli obviously. Oli obviously a lot more experienced at Vassal than we are. And Matt, I believe I'm right in saying that you maybe don't play on Vassal at all.
I'm planning to.
We'll let you away with that one. But even that, limited options. The decloak forward felt bad. So you can see that had Dale disengaged, he would have had the space from Whisper, because Whisper was unable to decloak in. He was either always going to go too far forwards and overshoot where Vader would be if he turned right, or he was too far up board, and therefore the barrel roll away would get him out of arc. Duchess here decides not to aileron on one hard sin. I think a combination of not wanting to get in the way of Vader. But actually, what it's left her with is now, even if Oli's Vader has 3 banked, he probably gets a shot, and it's looking a little bit concerning for Dale that actually he may not have a shot on Whisper at all here. You can see Ollie's just sort of taken a relatively simple, banked both of his ships in, and he's got a nice wide spread of arcs. I think really like the position of the Grand Inquisitor here. That being that a little bit further behind means that if Suntir is hard throwing into this gap, he's going to have to accept that the Inquisitor gets shots into the side of him. There's not really anything he can do about that. And we see Vader there just sort of turning towards that, very nicely judged, very close to that rock, and taking his passive sensors.
Is this kind of situation that really reinforces how good passive sensors is on Vader? Again, this kind of matchup.
Yeah, absolutely. I think passive sensors allows you to build, fatter aces, if you like, and spend more points on them because it gives you that ability to act outside of the activation phase. It's enormous on something like Vader.
Yeah, and not only that here, but we see the more traditional use of passive sensors in that had he not had it, Vader's option for the target lock this turn would have been Duchess. So if he barrel rolls to, he would almost be forced to barrel roll to the right and lock Duchess to get both the good quality shot this round and to avoid to open up his dial and that asteroid that he's near not being an issue for next round. But actually, with passive sensors, he can wait until Suntir and or Vader move into range, lock them, barrel towards them, thereby opening up his dial, not having to worry about that asteroid, and shooting at a much higher value target than Dale's Duchess, and also, in this instance, giving him the opportunity to focus fire rather than divide fire between Dale's ships. So all of that possible because of passive sensors, and without passive sensors, I think this is a very different matchup and heavily in Dale's favour, as you said, at the list building phase. So Suntir here, 3 harding in, and has to decide sort of whether to stick or twist here, really. He's in a relatively good defensive position at the moment. He's not taking shots from Whisper. His shot from the Inquisitor is looking like it might just be at range 3, where obviously with the Inquisitor's ability, he's still going to get those 3 attack dice, but Suntir would then be on 4 defense dice. And Vader would have to reposition, unfortunately can do, but would have to reposition to get to him. Or the kind of alternative is the more aggressive play, and that's what Dale decides to go for, which I think in the end is a combination of the boost and the barrel roll to get range 1 with Whisper and to get his free focus and to get his Predator lined up. So kind of spending both actions there, but getting 2 mods on offense. And speaking to Dale after the game, his kind of plan here was he'd realised he was going to get a slightly suboptimal opening engagement, but was hopeful that he could, if not kill, could do some serious damage to Whisper before he had fired, and therefore maybe get a trade, which meant that he was still in the game. Whisper, obviously, with those 2 evade dice, has the free evade, has the force, but doesn't love taking 2 shots at I6. Vader with the 3 straight here, so has the option for the afterburners. And I think, for the reasons that we were discussing with Suntir, is going to take the boost straight forwards. Yeah, there we see it. And then take the lock on Whisper. And Dale really has decided that his way out of trouble here is to kind of do some serious damage to Whisper.
And again, worth noting here, so if he'd chosen to lock Oli's Vader that he has at range 1, Oli's Vader, when it activates, which is going to be before Dale's Vader, can then just barrel roll out of arc. Take a lock on Duchess and barrel roll out of arc, and so that's how it becomes entirely useless. And so now, having at the start of the game talked about how both of the Darth Vaders were potentially the most valuable pieces in the list or in this matchup, Oli, because of passive sense again, can ensure that his Vader, he is choosing how many shots it takes.
Yeah, and had Dale done that, would have been disastrous, right? Because although forcing Oli to shoot his Vader at Duchess is not nothing, the major deficit would have been that the Dale's Vader would have been shooting 2 dice into Whisper, incredibly unlikely to do any meaningful damage, and Dale would have come out of that trade much worse. So I think in terms of deciding who's got better engagement here, because of everything we've just said, and we'll let it roll forward until we see the passive sensors maybe before we decide. So we're seeing the opening shots, and Suntir nicely lined up, gets his free focus, and then we get the passive sensors from Oli.
And as that happens, I think it's worth noting how good the Suntir reposition was. Right, I did not like the 3-turn in at all, but that double reposition to ensure that Suntir still got bullseye, so still gets predator, still gets a token from what was a very bad position is very nicely done by Dan and very, very nicely judged.
Yeah, absolutely. And you saw there as he lined up the bullseye, it wasn't by much. So sort of very fine margins that Dale was able to kind of decide upon there. Oli here identifying Suntir, and I think this is something he said at the start of the game, was that Suntir was the one that he was worried about with the kind of reposition or with the mobility and moving after his list. So he's taking the opportunity here to try and get rid of Suntir on turn 1 of the game. Takes the lock. And so this, with being the final position of the opening engagement, Matt, why don't you start us off and sort of talk us through who you think's got the better of it, and whether it's sort of even or pretty one-sided, or what you feel.
So I think, well, firstly, Dale's Suntir is probably going to be very lucky to get out of this alive, I suspect, with all three of them having decent quality shots. On the return side, Whisper may well survive, but even if we say we lose Whisper and we lose Suntir, points-wise, Dale is up. But I think, as you say, the positional power of Suntir as an endgame ship is probably more important. So I'm favouring Oli at this point.
Yeah, and I am too. And I think that Oli has his first choice target, whereas Dale has sort of had to go for second best a little bit. I think that because of the evade and the force, that Whisper is unlikely to die here and actually could get away, not particularly badly hurt. I think the other thing that makes that likely is that unless Dale decides to sacrifice Suntir entirely, he can't spend that focus on attack. And you see here that first attack from Vader has already put a crit into Suntir. He's taken a stun pilot. So you've kind of almost forcing Suntir to admit he's dead or to keep that focus for defense. Again, reducing the damage output coming into Whisper. And I think the third thing is Duchess has not got a shot on Whisper. So whereas Oli is focus firing on his primary target, Dale is spreading fire, and two of his ships going into very much a secondary target in the case of Whisper. So I think I would award this one to Oli as well. Lloyd, any sort of dissenting opinions?
The only thing I think I would change is which of Oli's ships is his most valuable. In this matchup, with Vader moving before both Suntir and Dale's Vader, I think actually Oli tends to value his Whisper higher than Vader and will generally trade Vader for something. And so I think Oli would probably rather the positions of Whisper and Vader were swapped, and it was Vader taking 2 shots and Whisper taking a poor quality one. But even with that said, I think Oli has a much better position here. He's putting 10 dice into a single token Suntir and has a very, very high chance of taking off the board and has a pretty low chance of losing much of anything. Like if he loses shields on Whisper and on Vader, he can count himself fairly unlucky and is still in a strong position if he kills Suntir.
And I think finally to look at that positional side from next turn, with the Inquisitor and Whisper moving first, and with Whisper likely to be able to get his evade back, to be able to cloak, it then becomes very difficult for Dale with Vader to go anywhere safe. So I think from a target, from focus fire point of view, from a target choice, and from positioning for next turn, I think I'd award all three of those to Oli, and say that he has definitely got the better of this initial engagement. Anything sort of final points, guys? Matt, what are the kind of takeaways from the engagements that we've watched?
The main thing is that it's taking your time is really important. Having a game plan going in. We haven't really talked about this. You touched on it a couple of times in terms of you having game plans for the games that we were looking at earlier. But that's really important. Knowing which ship you want to try and go for, knowing where you want the open engagement to be, and knowing which bit of the opponent's list you think you can try and isolate or pounce on first. I think all of those things give you a much better chance of achieving it than having like one or two set setups and just going through the motions each time, irrespective of what you're facing.
Yeah, I think that's a really strong point. I think I'm certainly not a fan of those set setups because I think the risk there is that you find yourself repeating the opening 3 moves, almost ignoring what the opponent's doing, and then suddenly you look up and you're getting out positions. Cool. And Lloyd, leave it to you to wrap up.
Yeah, I think it's something we talked about a lot, right? But it's players that go in with a plan are the ones that are engineering everything towards that. So where you're putting your rocks, where you're placing your ships, your initial setups, where the spaces you're moving into are all built into that plan and will lead into the things you're trying to achieve. And I think that's really good practice in every game, but it's something you get practicing doing it on the fly, because you'll go into tournaments and you'll come up against lists and people you never met before and ships that you don't usually see on the table, and being able to work those things out as you go with the asterisks. Obviously all of those plans are slightly fluid as game states change, is what elevates people to the next level of competition.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things that actually the kind of janky games can be really useful for. So we all know that practice is good and that you can take your competitive list and get 100 reps with it, then you're going to be in an incredibly good position. You're going to have played it more than the vast majority of people you run against. But actually, for those of us who like to experiment, like to play different stuff, when you run into the more janky matchup, and actually you probably think to yourself, well, I'm not really going to learn a lot about competitive X-Wing from this game where I've taken all of the named Sikhs and Lloyd is running a triple upsilon list. What you can do is exactly as Lloyd said, practice working out on the fly. I've not seen this before. How do I engage? What are my win conditions? What's my target priority? And where do I need the rocks to be? That you can get from any game of X-Wing you ever play. And I think you can have fun and get better X-Wing at the same time. Okay, and that's it. That's the final game of this episode. Hopefully people have enjoyed it and found it useful. Please leave us some comments, say if you liked it. We're certainly going to be sticking to our normal programming of going through a single game with one of the players involved most weeks, but we might come back and do a couple more of these. We're thinking we could look at sort of some mid-game engagements and then some end-game situations in future weeks. So I think we'll leave it there and say, Matt, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
We'll have to get you on Vassal and get you on for an actual game at some point.
Yeah.